Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. My name is Dr. Drum McNaughton, and I'm the CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps university leaders create sustainable higher ed institutions through holistic approaches to strategic management, university academics and operations, change management, leadership, and governance. Our podcast brings you the latest in higher ed news, as well as some of the top experts in our profession who will share with you their perspectives on how you can grow your institution. Our guest today is Gerry Czarnecki, Chair and CEO of the National Leadership Institute and principal stockholder of the Deltinium Group, which helps organizations achieve peak performance through effective leadership, focused strategy, effective organization, and sound financial management. Gerry currently serves as the chair of the Board of Trustees for the National University System, and he's going to be talking with us about mergers and acquisitions as growth strategy for higher education institutions. Gerry, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to having you on the show. Hey, you have been involved in M&A work, mergers and acquisitions work, for many, many years, and now we're starting to see this come to the forefront in higher ed. Why is this?
Well, that's a really important question because you could probably look back over the last several decades, maybe even century, and not really see much in the way of what we would normally call mergers and acquisitions. There are two things I think that are most critical. One is that there is an awful lot of pressure on the small to medium-sized colleges and universities in the country who happen to also have relatively small endowments. There's an awful lot of pressure on them, economic pressure on them, based on not only the changes in the dynamic of the demographics today, but also on the cost curves that have been built up as universities and colleges have gone through the last several decades. So pressure one is some of those smaller colleges and universities are under financial stress, and they're looking for ways to solve their problem. And one way to solve it is the notion of either merging with or being merged into another organization. Secondly is that there's an awful lot of pressure for the nonprofit community to figure out what to do about the out-of-favor for-profits. And so there is a merger and acquisition type activity that's going on, and not the least of which is an example would be the Purdue Global transaction, where the for-profit entity needed a future, needed to figure out how it was going to have a future, and not-for-profits are clearly in favor and for-profits are clearly out of favor. And it's not completely changed even with the change in the administration.
No, I see that very clearly. There's an awful lot of the for-profits who are attempting to make the transition to nonprofits, but that isn't always the easiest way to do it, and it certainly doesn't solve their perception problems, at least immediately.
Well, that's true. Look, the Purdue Global situation is a great example of the challenges. Purdue, quote, bought, and I say that in quotes, because they basically got the franchise of the online courseware of the Kaplan organization. But Kaplan retains a really big chunk of what's actually happening in that institution that is now called Purdue Global. That online back office processing and support, the OPM, that Kaplan operates is still a for-profit. And the courses are offered through a not-for-profit entity, but Kaplan still has a big piece of what's going on in that Purdue Global transaction. And they're being, in essence, paid for the rights to that university over time by the profit they're going to make. And it's not an easy transition. It was a pretty gutsy move on Purdue's part to incorporate that kind of a transaction with the brand name into a, quite frankly, a top-tier university setting. And their faculty had a hard time with it to start with.
Well, that brings up a really interesting point, and I remember it very well years ago when HP acquired Compaq, is the culture differences. And faculty generally tend to be very conservative. They don't like a lot of change. They're not wild about online education. And then trying to get two universities, one of which is a tier one research university, very, very high reputation. And then you've got Kaplan as an online. I can imagine faculty were not happy about this at all.
Well, from all reports, the faculty was furious when it first started. And they've kind of come to a truce, at least for the time being. But the, quote, R1 university faculty, when it thinks about its brand being diluted by this thing called Purdue Global, I am confident that there's still a bunch of rustling in the bushes at the university campus. That said, Purdue is spending a ton of money to market Purdue Global. It's in almost every market that I've traveled to. There are TV and radio ads all over the place for Purdue Global. So they've made a major commitment to market those programs. And they're trying to keep the marketing positioning separate. And it's yet to be found whether they really are able to keep their faculty happy about it. But there's no doubt it's a challenge.
Well, and it makes perfect sense to why it's a challenge. You don't necessarily agree with it. But when you bring two cultures together like that, it's sometimes like oil and water. And that's one thing that when folks are doing mergers and acquisitions, they need to think about is how are the cultures going to match together?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. And the culture of the back office and the support systems for Kaplan, although I don't want to make Kaplan sound like an evil organization because they really are a pretty high quality organization and stayed pretty much out of trouble in terms of the scrutiny of the for-profit community. But there's no doubt about it. The online degree programs themselves are of themselves a challenging culture to the in-classroom campus programs that an R1 institution is experienced in providing. So you're absolutely right. There's a totally different culture. And in my judgment, that I would guess that Purdue has worked hard to keep those cultures as far away from each other as they can.
I suspect you're right. Change management, especially, the integration of cultures, is one of the most difficult things that we end up doing as a consulting firm. And I can tell you that it's never easy. It's like that old saying about boards. When you've seen one board, you've seen one board. When you've seen one culture, you've seen one culture. And yeah, there may be some synergies between the two. You have to leverage those. But most of the time in higher ed, it's like oil and water.
No doubt about it. And as you know, I might as well throw it out right now. As you know, we at National University are about to experience that very fact because, as has been publicly aware, National University, which is a not-for-profit system, we have three current universities in the system: National University, which is the original mothership, JFK University in Northern California, and City University of Seattle. All three of those entities are affiliates of the National University system. And the system has announced and will, with the appropriate WASC and DOE approvals, the system will be acquiring a for-profit university system that is an online, mostly graduate education program, both the master's and doctoral levels, called North Central University. And so we're going to get some real experience in that ourselves as we bring that into the university system and convert it to a not-for-profit.
Which, yeah, and it brings me to the next point, because you've done something that many institutions haven't done, is you've gone out and you've looked for new market segments that you could move into, as well as different core competencies. For example, Patton University, you just acquired that. And that has, from what I've heard, one of the best LMS systems, learning management systems, of any online university, including those home built and some of those that are commercially available as well.
Yeah, we actually are pretty happy with that acquisition. And you're right. It had what was called the University Now platform, and which we now call FlexCourse. And it was a very heavily competency-based program. I actually took one of the courses when we were looking at it to get some exposure to it, and it's exceptionally well done. Well, in the process, as we bought that and we're doing a teach out on patent and incorporating it into our online program offerings at the undergraduate level, but we've had to make some significant adjustments to that program. Fortunately, it's relatively modern technology, so it's been a little easier than it might have been in one of those commercially available LMSs. But we have had to make significant changes in order to satisfy the Title IV funding requirements that are obviously, as you know, driven by Carnegie units and not by simply assessing competency in the learning experience. So, but it is a great platform, and we have great hopes for it being an important part of how we transform the online learning experience at all of our universities.
Well, it makes perfect sense. You're going out, you're acquiring the technology, you're acquiring the market space, the graduate degrees like what North Central does. And I know that you have some of those already, but it's a different segment. And it gets you far more into the online marketplace, which currently with the demographics that are out there, the traditional college students are decreasing. Those numbers, the 18 to 24-year-old segment is decreasing and has been for quite a long time. And you've got 74% of all the students out there are the, quote, post-traditionals, 24 to 70 years old, and they're going back to school for different reasons. So what you're doing makes perfect sense.
Well, it turns out that a national university system was basically began its existence in focusing on the, quote, non-traditional student. And our average age of student in all three of the universities we currently have, the average age is in excess of 34 years old. So we have very few first-time freshmen who join our organization in any one of our universities. And that's obviously true in the North Central situation because they have close to 10,000 students and 3/4 of the programs are doctoral programs online. So as a practical matter, it's a logical extension of what we have been committed to, which is the adult learner.
And there's two ways that you can grow an institution. One is organic growth. And, for instance, if you're going to move into the online sector, you go ahead and build it from scratch. And I know the Ivies are finally getting into online. University of Pennsylvania is moving to the online in their undergraduate. The other is acquisition. If you can do both of those, great, but usually the most cost-effective way is acquisition.
Well, in our case, in our current system, the three universities that I mentioned, we moved from being innovators with a few students 20 years ago in the online space to where in our universities overall, we have over 51% of our students are online. So we already have a pretty robust synchronous and asynchronous online program. In fact, we have asynchronous options for all of our national university programs. All of them have a synchronous and an asynchronous option so that we can teach a hybrid course or we can teach a completely asynchronous course. So for us, the acquisition of North Central is critical in two ways. One is that it's completely online. Two is that its faculty is in all 50 states. So there's a very virtual faculty that we pick up, and the programs are one-on-one so that when you enter a graduate program, you have one faculty member who's going to walk you through your entire experience. And because they're all asynchronous, then what we have is we have picked up not only a pretty efficient OPM support back office, but we've also picked up a large number, over 24 programs, the majority of which are doctoral in nature. So it's a major, for us, it was a fast way to get a broad range of doctoral programs and a doctoral faculty that is widely dispersed throughout the United States and a very high qualified faculty.
It makes perfect sense. So National's acquisitions have been very strategic in nature, is what I'm hearing you say.
You bet. We've looked at lots of opportunities and walked away from many others.
So what do you think is the future of the for-profit sector?
Great question, and I'm not sure I know. I don't think that the for-profit sector is going to disappear. I do think that they may morph away towards a higher concentration of those who survive being the distributors, what I call the distributors, because when you look at several of the MOOC organizations that take Coursera, Udacity, or for that matter, edX, these organizations are turning into not just providing MOOC experiences, but they're turning into distributors of traditional degree programs. And increasingly, I would say high quality programs from large, even R1 institutions are marketing their, in many cases, graduate programs, isolated, specific graduate programs through the Udacities and Coursera's of the world as an alternative marketing channel. And so as a practical matter, we may see more and more of the for-profits doing more and more of that and less of the outright for-profit university, because what we've seen is that more than one not-for-profit, I mean, Kaplan did it, but there are others, as you know, that have basically sold their for-profit business to a not-for-profit entity. Sometimes they create it, sometimes somebody like Purdue is the one that creates it. And so they're in the business of servicing academic institutions more than they are being academic institutions.
Which makes perfect sense. Some of the mergers that I'm hearing out there are primarily to be able to share services in the back offices. I mean, you've got TCS Education System, which does that for a number of their schools.
Yeah, and those guys aren't cheap, so that the universities that are using them to supply online education don't have a lot of margin room based on what cost it is going to be able to provide the online education space. But at least they have online offerings. Unfortunately, for a lot of the smaller institutions, it's almost impossible for them to establish the infrastructure to do an effective job on online education. So it may be the only way that a lot of the smaller to medium-sized colleges and universities are going to be able to stay competitive in the online space.
I agree 100%. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but we're seeing a lot of changes in the regulatory factors between the Obama and the Trump administrations, but also in accreditation. Can you talk to that just a little bit?
Well, I don't know where it's going. I know where I'd like it to go, but I don't know where it's going. I've had a number of conversations with different folks. On the accreditation side, there are not a lot of people who believe that we're going to move dramatically away from the kind of accreditation process that we see. I'd like to see more change, but I don't think we're going to see dramatic change on accreditation. I think that from what I can see in and hear from folks who represent the current administration, and not the least of which is Secretary DeVos, I happened to see her speak a week ago, and her position is more focused not on the change in the standards, but rather more focused on making Title IV funds more available for a broader variety of learning experiences. And so I think that you're going to see, and when they ultimately come out with this current administration's thoughts on this matter, they're looking to be able to improve the flow of funds from the federal funding sources programs. They've got a pretty strong feeling that we shouldn't be committing all post-secondary education funding to only what we now call traditional higher ed. So I think that's going to be where the big change is going to be from a DOE standpoint. From an accreditation standpoint, clearly I would like to see much more willingness to think in competency-based terms simply because I think that it's much more important to know that people are learning and being able to demonstrate learning outcomes than it is to demonstrate how long they sat in a seat. I'm not super optimistic that that's going to change overnight.
Yeah, I think that actually needs to come from Department of Education, is moving away from the strict Carnegie method of determining learning to more of a competency based. And I think that process is going to be very challenging because this is the way it's been for well over 100 years.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And people I talk to in Washington are not optimistic. People who want to see that change happen are not optimistic that even this administration is willing to go fight that battle.
I agree. And that's everything that I've heard as well. That may be the next president, next administration, who knows? But I think ultimately it has to happen, and it needs to be a broad coalition that brings it forward rather than just the ed department or something else, because the universities are going to have strong pushback on that because this is the way they get funded, is by credit hour.
Well, and let's not kid ourselves. I know I'm going to sound like your resident cynic, but let's not kid ourselves. Accreditation is the university system's greatest barrier to entry. Universities love the accreditation system because it takes so long to be able to develop a prima facie credibility in an accreditation that you as a potential competitor can get frustrated before you get accredited.
I've seen that happen as well. I'm not sure how you get past that particular thing because there needs to be a baseline quality standard, but who's to say what that standard should be?
Yeah, no, it's a conundrum. There's no doubt about it. I'm not saying that we don't want to have some kind of quality control on the quality of the education, but unfortunately, that also has been used pretty effectively to prevent competitors from entering. You know, North Central is a fully WASC accredited university, but they have had a very, very intense focus on maintaining the accreditation standards. And so they've gotten all those doctoral programs by working their hearts out to make sure that they satisfy every one of those accreditation standards.
I get it completely. The model there is so very different. I remember my alma mater Fielding Graduate University went through the same challenge because it's a Oxford tutorial model, a one-on-one.
Yep.
How do you measure learning in that? How do you report student outcomes? How do you work on time to graduation? They had to make multiple changes to make sure that they were satisfying WASC's requirements.
Which is exactly what we've had to do with the patent model, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very efficient model, but we had to be able to demonstrate that there were contact hours. If you can't demonstrate contact hours, an asynchronous online program could find itself not accredited because it doesn't have contact.
Very true. So if you were going to advise a university president about the three things that they need to consider if they're thinking about a merger, what would those be?
Well, I'd start with your first observation earlier, which is you better look at the culture and make sure that if you're going to bring it into the organization, you got to make sure that it is not a totally contrary culture. And there are differences in a for-profit culture and a not-for-profit culture. So if you're going out and looking at a for-profit entity, you better test the water and see just how much of a business they see themselves as opposed to a learning institution. I think the second is you got to basically ask yourself the question, whether it's a for-profit or a not-for-profit, is do they have programs, faculty, and administrative support that is consistent and that will integrate effectively with your own? Because the faculty ultimately is important. They are the content. They own the content. They are the content generators. It doesn't matter which faculty you talk about. You have to have a group of people who are the content experts and who drive the learning experience through their content. So you got to be able to evaluate the quality of that academic support function. It's not just something that you can import easily. You have to make sure that it fits your own model about how it's going to operate. And then thirdly, you need to make sure that you have to look at it, whether you like it or not, whether people like the terminology or not, you have to look at it as a business. And you have to ask yourself, are they hopelessly lost as a business model? Are there programs that are of interest to the marketplace? One of the biggest challenges institutions are having today is pruning and culling their programs and having the courage to look faculty in the eye and say, by the way, that course you only have 5 people in, it's costing us red ink. We can't continue to teach that course. You may like it, you may love that topic, but the students don't want it. And if the students don't want it, we can't afford to provide it. That's a really tough academic decision. But if a potential acquirer or merging candidate has programs that nobody wants, part of the reason their business model is broken is because nobody wants them. So you have to be careful that you don't take on something that is so broken that you can't fix it no matter what you try.
Thank you. That's great advice to your fellow presidents and board chairs. So what's next for Gerry Czarnecki? What makes you excited about staying involved in higher ed?
Well, I have to admit that we made that one acquisition and we're making a second one, a big one. And quite frankly, the next couple of years, we have to make certain that it works. We've got a leadership team that understands the challenges, but we need to bring that entity into the organization, make sure that we both protect it from the legacy understandings that we have, and at the same time, not have it be a countercultural event at the same time. And then secondly is, I believe, and you and I have conversed about this, I believe that the disruption that's going on in higher ed is really just started. And being able to survive and ultimately thrive in the higher ed space, or what I prefer to call the post-secondary space, is going to take a lot of intense focus to fine-tune the systems and processes and, quite frankly, the cost structure of institutions if they're going to be able to compete. Because in our case, competition for our adult student has heated up dramatically. And whether we like it or not, it's competition that is not just because more traditional institutions have decided that there's a large segment out there that they haven't paid enough attention to, but they're also competing on price. And a lot of them have state subsidies, federal subsidies. A lot of them have large endowments that can make it very difficult for us to compete against the decision they might make to, quote, give away their offerings. Just this morning, there was an article about this very subject, and there was a quote in there from the president of the University of Virginia, who said that for families earning less than $80,000 a year, which is no small ticket of income, for families earning less than $80,000 a year, tuition is going to be free. And if they earn less than $30,000 a year, they get room and board free as well. Now, they're going to have to get admitted, and they're a university that has admission standards. They're not an open access institution. But that is a stunning announcement. And look, the New York University, NYU, is not charging their medical school students any tuition. So this price competition thing is going to be huge in the spaces that we operate in. And we have to make sure that we can make sure that our economic condition, our cost structure, can deal with that kind of thinking.
That's a great wrap up, Gerry. Thank you. There's just so many changes going on. Would love to have you back in a couple of months and talk about some of the things that you've observed in your merger. How does that sound?
That sounds like a great idea. Love to do it.
Great. So, Gerry, thanks so much for being on the show. It's always a pleasure, and we look forward to the next time. Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Gerry Czarnecki, the chair of the National University System Board. Thanks, Gerry. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to having you on the show again in the future. Our next episode will feature yours truly doing some prognostications on what's going to happen in 2019, as well as a look back to 2018 and the key news. The Change Leaders Deb Maui will be joining us to interview me. You don't want to miss it. It should be a lot of fun. If you like this podcast, please take a minute to subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on the Apple Podcast app, would you please take a moment to give us a rating and review? You can find out more information and show notes at changinghighered.com. And if you have guests and/or other topics you'd like to hear about, please email us at podcast@changinghighered.com to let us know. Remember, creating sustainable higher ed institutions requires three things: taking a holistic view of your institution, aligning strategies, structures, and processes, and ensuring stakeholders are attuned to where you're going. Without any of those three things, you won't get your institution where you want it to go. Until next time.